Welcome back to the show. We have, well, a pretty massive stack of articles, biographies, and industry reports on the desk today, and we're turning our attention to a subject that really requires us to rethink the whole concept of longevity in the music business.
It really does.
We're looking at a group that has managed to remain relevant, active, and I think creatively restless for nearly 5 decades now. We are talking about Duran Duran. Now, I have to be honest with you. When I first saw we were doing an analysis of this band, my brain went straight to one very specific image.
I think I know where you're going with this.
A yacht, a pastel suit, maybe a little too much hairspray, and, the video for Rio. It's very easy to view them solely through that lens of 1980s nostalgia.
It is, but it's also incredibly limiting.
Exactly. If we stop there, we're missing the much larger, more complex story of their survival and their evolution. We are looking at a band that formed in 1978 and is still releasing music, touring, and innovating right here in 2026.
It's a career trajectory that really defies the standard logic of the pop music industry. Usually, bands that achieve that level of hysteria, that Fab Five mania they experienced, they burn out. They fade away within 3 or 4 years.
The machine just spits them out.
Right. The industry is designed to consume youth and then move on to the next big thing. Duran Duran certainly had the burnout, which we will get into, but they didn't fade away.
No.
So our mission here is to understand how they managed that transition, how they went from being the pinups of the MTV generation to becoming, well, elder statesmen of art pop. We need to look at the musical innovations that so often got overshadowed by their image.
Things like their contributions to remix culture and, of course, music video production.
Especially music video production.
And the sheer statistics, they really back up that longevity. We're looking at source material that indicates they have sold over 100 million records globally, which is just a staggering number.
It's enormous. But there's another statistic that's arguably even more impressive.
Go on.
With their recent work in the 2020s, they have achieved the distinction of having top 5 albums in 5 consecutive decades.
5 decades. So that's the 1980s, 90s, Zollins, 10s, and now the 20s. That is a club with very, very few members. You're talking about artists like Paul McCartney or the Rolling Stones. That's elite territory.
It is. And it's why, when critics or casual listeners dismiss them as a manufactured pop group, they're ignoring the fundamental truth of the band.
It is.
That these guys wrote their own songs, they played their own instruments, and they navigated the business side of the industry with a fair amount of ruthlessness when it was necessary. They weren't put together by a producer in some boardroom. They built this whole thing themselves.
And there's so many details about their history that the average person just wouldn't know. I was surprised to learn, for instance, that despite having 3 members with the surname Taylor, that's John, Roger, and Andy, none of them are related.
It's a fantastic piece of trivia.
And they also aren't related to Roger Taylor from Queen. It's just a complete statistical anomaly.
A very common English surname, but a very uncommon coincidence.
Right. And another detail we'll get into is their humble beginnings, working as staff at the nightclub where they got their start. They weren't just playing on stage. They were the doormen and the bartenders.
Washing glasses, DJing. They were embedded in the club culture they came out of.
And, of course, the name itself. It comes from a character in the science fiction film Barbarella, specifically Dr. Duran Duran.
That connection to cinema is vital. It wasn't just a name they thought sounded cool. It was, I think, a statement of intent. They always saw their music as something visual, something cinematic. But to really understand that, we have to go back to where it all began.
Let's do it. Let's unpack the origins. We are going back to Birmingham, England in 1978. Now, usually when we talk about the UK music scene in the late 70s, we are talking about punk. We're talking about the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the anger, the grime.
The social commentary.
Exactly. And Birmingham was a very industrial city. The economy was in bad way. And by all accounts, it was a fairly great place to live. And you have these 2 childhood friends, John Taylor and Nick Rhodes. They are the nucleus of what would become Duran Duran. But they didn't want to reflect the grit of the city.
No, they wanted to escape it.
That's it.
And that is a key distinction. Punk was about reflecting the reality of the street. John Taylor and Nick Rhodes were interested in constructing a fantasy to get away from that reality.
So who was playing what at the start?
Well, John Taylor was actually on guitar initially, and Nick Rhodes was on synthesizers and takes. They were joined early on by a guy named Stephen Duffy on vocals and bass, and Simon Colley on clarinet and bass.
Clarinet! That's not what I expected.
It was a very different sound. It was an art school project as much as it was a band. They played their first gig on April 5, 1979 at Birmingham Polytechnic. But this lineup was incredibly unstable. Duffy and Colley were gone by June of 1979.
That early instability is something a lot of people just forget about. They assume the classic lineup just appeared out of nowhere, fully formed. But after Duffy and Colley left, they had to, completely rebuild.
They did. They brought in Andy Wickett on vocals for a while, and this is actually a crucial moment because Wickett co-wrote an early version of a song you might recognize.
Which one?
Girls on Film.
No way. So the DNA of their biggest hits was being formed even before the famous members had all arrived.
Exactly. The ideas were there. And the shift in instrumentation is also really important here. They hired Roger Taylor to play drums. He'd been in various local bands, including one with the great name, the Scent Organs.
Oh.
With a solid drummer finally in place, John Taylor made the decision to switch from guitar to bass. And that is a pivotal moment for the band's sound.
Why was that switch so important?
Because John Taylor's bass playing is so distinct. It's very funk-influenced, drawing heavily from bands like Chic from disco. That rhythm section, John on bass and Roger on drums, it became the driving force of their music. It's what separated them from a lot of the other synth-heavy bands of the time who were just using drum machines.
So they had the engine room, but they still needed a guitarist and a singer. This brings them to a place called the Rum Runner.
The Rum Runner nightclub on Broad Street in Birmingham. It essentially became their headquarters.
It wasn't just a venue for them, right? It was their home base.
It was everything.
Yep.
The owners of the club were the Barrow brothers, Paul and Michael. They saw potential in the band and became their managers, but they also put the band to work. This was not a free ride.
And this is that average person wouldn't know detail. They weren't living some kind of rock star life yet. Far from it.
Oh, absolutely not. They were washing glasses, they were working the door, they were DJing. Nick Rhodes was the club's DJ for about 10 pounds a night.
Which, in retrospect, was probably the best musical education he could have had.
Incredibly important for their development. Because he was in the DJ booth, he was absorbing all these different sounds coming out at the time. Punk, electronic, disco, David Bowie, Giorgio Moroder. He could see in real time what tracks made people run to the dance floor and what tracks cleared the room.
So he was doing market research every night.
In a way, yes. And that mixture of influences in the DJ booth directly translated to the music they were writing during the rehearsals at the club.
So they're working at the club, rehearsing during the day. They try out a few more members, but nothing's quite clicking.
Right. They have a guitarist named Alan Curtis for a bit and a singer, Jeff Thomas, but it doesn't work out. Curtis leaves, Thomas is fired. So they're down to the trio of Nick Rhodes, John Taylor, and Roger Taylor. They need the final two pieces of the puzzle.
And they find their guitarist through the music press.
They do. In April 1980, Andy Taylor answered an advertisement in Melody Maker. He came down from Newcastle upon Tyne. His background was quite different from the others. He had played in cover bands. He was a much more traditional rock guitarist. He loved AC/DC, heavy rock. He wasn't necessarily part of that art school synthesizer scene that Nick Rhodes was coming from.
But that created a kind of creative friction.
A vital friction. The tension between Nick Rhodes' electronic, almost art house synth style and Andy Taylor's aggressive, heavy rock guitar that created the unique tension in their sound. You can hear it on all those early records.
It's that blend, isn't it? The chic disco rhythms, the electronic atmosphere, and then this hard rock guitar cutting through it all. Okay, so all they need now is the vocalist.
The frontman. In May 1980, Simon Le Bon is recommended to the band. The story goes that an ex-girlfriend of his, who worked as a barmaid at the Rum Runner, told the band about him.
So it all comes back to the club.
It always comes back to the Rum Runner. Le Bon was a drama student at the University of Birmingham, which, explains a lot about his stage presence and his lyrical style.
And he shows up to the audition wearing pink leopard print trousers and carrying a book of poetry. You can't make this stuff up.
And apparently they were impressed immediately. They had a track they were working on, an instrumental, and Le Bon had a poem that fit the rhythm perfectly. That song became Sound of Thunder.
And just like that, the classic lineup was complete. Simon Le Bon on vocals, Nick Rhodes on keyboards, John Taylor on bass, Roger Taylor on drums, and Andy Taylor on guitar.
That's the five.
They played their first gig with this lineup on July 16, 1980 at the Rum Runner. And things moved incredibly fast after that.
Unbelievably fast. They spent the next few months writing what would essentially become their entire debut album. They go on tour as an opening act for Hazel O'Connor, and that tour sparks a bidding war between record labels.
Who was in the running?
It came down to EMI and Phonogram. They eventually signed with EMI in December 1980. They chose EMI largely because of this sense of patriotism and history, the label that was home to the Beatles.
Right. And it's interesting to note that right from the start, they were being associated with this new movement, the New Romantics.
Yes, a journalist named Betty Page, writing for Sounds magazine, coined the term. And she identified Duran Duran as the perfect fit for this new scene of flamboyance, synthesizers, fashion, and androgyny.
But they had ambitions beyond just a London club scene. They didn't want to be a niche band. They had global ambitions from day one.
They did. Their debut album, the self-titled Duran Duran, was released in June 1981. The first single, Planet Earth, hit the UK Top 20. But it was the third single that really just exploded everything.
Girls on Film.
Girls on Film. And we have to talk about the video for this. This wasn't just a promotional clip. It was a cultural event.
The hugely controversial one.
It was a watershed moment.
Yeah.
Directed by the duo Godley and Krem, who are artists in their own right. It featured pillow fights, mud wrestling, very stylized imagery that bordered on erotica.
And that was intentional, right?
It was designed to be controversial.
Yeah.
The band's management explicitly told the directors to make something sensational. Make something that would get played in the new video clubs, even if, or because the BBC would ban it.
And it worked. It got everyone talking. But crucially, this was all happening right as a new television channel was launching in the United States in August 1981.
MTV.
Music television. And MTV needed content. They had a 24-hour channel to fill. And at the beginning, very few American bands were making high-quality music videos.
But the British bands were. And Duran Duran was making the best ones. This is where that technical innovation you mentioned comes into play.
The 35mm film.
Exactly. Most videos at the time were shot on videotape. They look like soap operas, flat lighting, low resolution. It's very cheap looking. Duran Duran and their directors insisted on shooting on 35mm film stock.
The same stuff used for major motion pictures.
The very same. And this gave their videos a cinematic widescreen look. It had grain, it had depth of field. It was vastly superior to everything else on the air. When you watched MTV in 1982, a Duran Duran video looked like a mini-movie compared to everyone else's clips.
That cinematic quality was, it was fully realized with their second album, Rio, released in May of '82. This album is often cited as a masterpiece of pop production. It went to #2 in the UK, but in the US, it actually took a little longer to catch fire.
It was not an overnight success in America. Initially, Capitol Records in the US just didn't know what to do with them. They tried marketing them as a new romantic band, which didn't really mean much to an American audience at the time.
So what broke it open for them in the States?
It was a two-pronged attack. First, they remixed the album to emphasize the dance elements, boosting the bass and drums, and that started to gain traction in U.S. clubs. And then, once MTV got a hold of the video for Hungry Like the Wolf and put it into heavy rotation, the floodgates just opened.
The videos for the Rio album, Hungry Like the Wolf, Rio, Save a Prayer, they were shot on location in Sri Lanka and Antigua.
Which was, again, revolutionary. They weren't standing on some soundstage in London pretending to be somewhere else. They were actually in the jungle. They were on yachts wearing these incredible Anthony Price suits.
It projected this image of glamour, of travel, of pure escapism that was incredibly appealing, especially to, teenagers in suburban America.
It basically launched what became known as the Second British Invasion. You had this wave of British acts, Duran Duran, Culture Club, Eurythmics, conquering the U.S. charts. And it was largely driven by their visual dominance on MTV.
And by 1983, Duran Duran was arguably the biggest band in the world. The press dubbed them the Fab Five, a direct comparison to the Beatles.
Even Princess Diana famously declared them her favorite band. That was a huge cultural moment in the UK.
The hysteria was real. We're talking about scenes of them not being able to leave their hotels. They were being mobbed everywhere they went. And in 1983, they released their third album, Seven and the Ragged Tiger.
And that album gave them their first #1 single in the U.S., The Reflex.
Now, The Reflex is another great example of their musical savvy, isn't it? Because the hit version is not the album version.
Not at all. The album version is good, but the hit single was a remix by Nile Rodgers from Chic.
One of their heroes.
Exactly. And Rodgers took the tracks, he chopped them up, he added that iconic stuttering vocal effect, the Wex Her, and turned it into a funk pop monster.
And Duran Duran really pioneered this whole idea of the remix, the night version.
They did. Before digital sampling made it easy, they would actually go back into the studio and record extended, rearranged versions of their songs specifically for club play. They understood the dance floor better than almost any other rock band of that era.
So by 1984, They are on a massive global stadium tour. They're on the cover of Rolling Stone. They win 2 Grammy Awards for their video work. I mean, it seems like nothing can stop them,
But the cracks were starting to form. The lifestyle was
to
intense.
say the least.
There were substance abuse issues. The pressure to follow up hit after hit was immense. You can only sustain that level of mania for so long before something has to break.
And they reached a kind of peak in 1985 with A View to a Kill, the theme song for the James Bond film.
Which remained the only Bond theme to ever hit #1 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100. A huge achievement. But that recording session was famously tense. John Taylor has spoken about how difficult it was just to get everyone in the same room to work.
And then came Live Aid, July 13th, 1985.
Live Aid was meant to be a celebration, a high point. But for Duran Duran, it was effectively a farewell for the original lineup, even though they didn't know it at the time.
They played to 90,000 people in Philadelphia and an estimated 1.5 billion people watching on TV. And unfortunately for them, it's often remembered for one specific moment.
Simon Le Bon's bum note.
The bum note.
During A View to a Kill, he went for a high falsetto note that was, well, it was noticeably off-key, and the media just jumped all over it. They called it the bum note heard round the world.
That's harsh.
The Bomb later said it was the most embarrassing moment of his entire career. But beyond that one note, the performance really marked the end of an era. They had been working nonstop for 5 years. They desperately needed a break.
The break, however, turned into a full-on fracture. They didn't just take time off, they split into 2 separate side projects. And this is a fascinating period because it really reveals the internal musical tug-of-war that was going on inside the band.
It does. The band divides almost perfectly along their core musical influences.
So on one side, you had John Taylor and Andy Taylor.
Right. They wanted to explore their rock and funk roots. They teamed up with Robert Palmer on vocals and the incredible Tony Thompson from Chic on drums to form the Power Station.
And that was a very different sound.
Very different. It was hard-hitting, aggressive funk rock. And it was very successful. It allowed Andy Taylor to play the heavy guitar riffs he loved and John Taylor to play the solid funk grooves he loved.
And on the other side of the split, you had Simon Le Bon, Nick Rhodes, and Roger Taylor.
They formed Arcadia. And this was the art school side of Duran Duran. Atmospheric, moody, very stylish, very synth-heavy. They released the album, So Red the Rose.
So you have these 2 successful but very different projects happening at the same time.
Yes, but Nick Rhodes later called this move commercial suicide. By dividing the band, they essentially split their fan base, and they diluted the Duran Duran brand. But creatively, it showed just how diverse their talents were.
The problem was, when it came time to regroup and make another Duran Duran album, not everyone came back to the table.
Roger Taylor was the first to go. He was suffering from severe exhaustion after those 5 years of mania. He just retired to the English countryside to get away from it all.
And then Andy Taylor.
Andy had tasted success with the Power Station and a solo career. He found he couldn't really work with the band anymore. There were creative differences, legal battles, and eventually, he was out.
So by 1986, the Fab Five is suddenly down to a trio: Simon Le Bon, Nick Rhodes, and John Taylor.
That's it. And they proceeded to record the album Notorious. They brought in Nile Rodgers to produce, and he ended up playing guitar on several tracks. They also hired a session guitarist named Warren Cucurullo, who was formerly of Frank Zappa's band and Missing Persons.
Notorious is a great album. The title track was a hit. But commercially, it didn't do what Rio or Seven and the Ragged Tiger did. The sound was funkier, more mature, less overtly pop.
And the critics, well, they were not kind.
This is where we see that phenomenon you mentioned, the Bee Gees curse, come into play.
Yes. The musician Moby later wrote about this in relation to Duran Duran. It's the idea that if you write amazing songs and sell tons of records, especially if you're good-looking, you incur the wrath or just the disinterest of the rock-obsessed critical establishment.
They just wouldn't let them grow up.
They wouldn't let Duran Duran transition from teen idols to respected musicians. They wanted to keep them in that boy band box, even though they were writing and playing everything themselves.
So the late 80s become a real struggle for them. They released Big Thing in 1988, which experimented with house music and rave sounds. Warren Cucurullo becomes a full member, along with a drummer named Sterling Campbell. But by the time they get to 1990 and the album Liberty,
they were really losing momentum. The musical landscape had changed completely. Grunge was coming. Nirvana and Pearl Jam were about to change everything. Hip-hop was exploding. Synth-pop was decidedly out.
And Liberty was seen as a low point.
It was a critical and commercial failure. It failed to capitalize on the band's history or point to a clear future. But then, just when everyone had completely written them off, they pulled off one of the greatest comebacks in music history.
We're talking about 1993, the album that is technically self-titled, but everyone calls it the wedding album.
Yes, because of the cover art, which featured their parents' wedding photos. A very clever way of signaling a return to their roots.
And the lead single from that album was Ordinary World.
Ordinary World is the key to their survival in the 90s. It was this beautiful, soaring ballad that had absolutely nothing to do with the current trends of grunge or techno. It was just a timeless, great song.
And there's an interesting story about how it became a hit, right?
There is. It was actually leaked to a radio station in Florida. And the listener reaction was so strong, so immediate, that the label was forced to release it earlier than planned.
It went to number 3 in the US and number 6 in the UK. And it won Simon Le Bon and Ivor Novello Award for songwriting.
That award was crucial because it was the industry, their peers, finally acknowledging them as serious songwriters, not just pretty faces. The follow-up single, Come Undone, was also a massive hit.
And suddenly, Duran Duran was cool again. They were filling stadiums in parts of the world they'd never even played before, like South Africa and parts of Southeast Asia.
But the volatility was always there, just under the surface. In 1995, they released a covers album called Thank You,
which was critically panned at the time.
Viciously panned. People mocked their versions of Public Enemy's 9/11 is a Joke and Bob Dylan's Lay Lady Lay. However, it is worth noting that Lou Reed publicly stated that Duran Duran's cover of his song Perfect Day was the best cover of his work ever done.
That's high praise.
So the artists themselves appreciated it, even if the critics didn't.
This resurgence, though, it took a massive hit in 1997. John Taylor, the founder, the heartthrob bassist, announced he was leaving the band.
And he did it at a fan convention, of all places. He announced he was leaving for good. He needed to sort out his personal life and wanted to pursue solo work.
So this leaves the band as just Simon Le Bon and Nick Rhodes from the original lineup, with Warren Cucurullo on guitar.
It was a very dark period for them. They released an album called Medazzaland in 1997, which wasn't even released physically in the UK at the time because of label issues.
But again, even in this dark period, we see their innovation.
We do. The single from that album, Electric Barbarella, was one of the very first songs ever sold digitally over the internet. They were embracing the future of music distribution before the industry even really understood what it was.
And then their next video, for Someone Else Not Me, was the first one produced entirely with Flash animation.
Always ahead of the curve technologically.
They followed that with the album Pop Trash in 2000, which was a commercial disappointment. It really seemed like the end of the road. But then, the year 2001 brought the news that fans had been dreaming of for 15 years.
The reunion.
The reunion of the original five.
Yes. Simon Le Bon approached John Taylor, and they agreed to get the original five back together. This meant parting ways with Warren Cucurullo, which was handled professionally. He went back to reform his old band, Missing Persons. But suddenly you had Simon, Nick, John, Roger, and Andy all in the same room again, writing music.
The industry was skeptical, though. Record labels weren't biting initially. They thought it was just a nostalgia cash grab.
So the band decided to tour to prove their worth, to prove there was still an audience. And they sold out everywhere. Japan, the UK, the US. They played a sold-out run at Wembley Arena. The chemistry was still there. The fans were still there.
And this led to the album Astronaut in 2004. The single Reach Up for the Sunrise was a genuine, bona fide hit. It reached number 5 in the UK.
It felt like a victory lap. They were receiving Lifetime Achievement Awards from MTV and the Brits. They were finally getting their due as legends.
But, as seems to be the pattern with Duran Duran, stability is temporary. In 2006, Andy Taylor left the band for the second time.
Yes. The band released a statement saying there was an unworkable gulf between them and Andy.
It was a difficult split.
It was. Andy Taylor later revealed in his book that there were tensions with management, and he was also dealing with his father's death at the time. The band continued on, bringing in a guitarist named Dom Brown to handle live duties.
And he's been with them ever since.
He has. He's not an official member in the same way the founders are, but he's an integral part of their live and studio sound now.
This post-Andy era saw them collaborating with some really interesting producers. They worked with Timbaland and Justin Timberlake on Red Carpet Massacre in 2007.
Which was a bit of a misstep commercially. It felt like they were chasing trends rather than setting them, which is never a good look for them.
But then they connected with Mark Ronson.
And Mark Ronson was the perfect collaborator for them. He was a super fan who grew up listening to them, but he was also a modern hit maker who understood their DNA.
He produced All You Need Is Now in 2010.
And critics hailed it as a return to their roots, specifically the Rio-era sound. It felt like Duran Duran sounding like Duran Duran again, but with modern production. It was a triumph.
They followed that with Paper Gods in 2015, which gave them their highest U.S. chart debut in 22 years. And then in 2021 came the album Future Past.
Future Past is significant. It featured collaborations with people like Graham Coxon from Blur and the legendary Giorgio Moroder, one of their original influences.
And it secured that amazing statistic we mentioned at the top of the show.
The top 5 albums in 5 consecutive decades. It proved that they could still produce relevant, high-quality music in the streaming age.
And then 2022 brought the ultimate validation, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
They won the fan vote by a landslide, with over 1 million votes, but the ceremony itself was bittersweet.
It was incredibly emotional. The 4 members, Simon, Nick, John, and Roger, went up to accept the award. And everyone was expecting, or at least hoping, that Andy Taylor would join them for a reunion performance.
But he wasn't there. And Simon Le Bon read a letter from Andy on stage. And the letter revealed that Andy had been fighting stage 4 metastatic prostate cancer for 4 years.
Just a devastating moment.
It was. But it also brought a sense of closure and renewed bond between the original members, even in Andy's physical absence. It was clear there was still a lot of love there.
And that brings us to the most recent era, leading right up to today in early 2026. Following the Hall of Fame induction, the band didn't slow down at all. In late 2023, they released a new album, Dance Macabre.
Dance Macabre is a fascinating project. It's a Halloween-themed album. Apparently, it started from a show they played in Las Vegas on Halloween 2022. They enjoyed it so much they decided to make a whole record around that spooky, dark aesthetic.
And what's remarkable about it is who plays on it.
It features contributions from both Andy Taylor and Warren Cucurullo. So despite the splits, the health issues, all the history, the extended family came back together on the record.
The album features reworkings of old songs, some covers, and some new tracks. They did a great version of Psycho Killer by Talking Heads, and a new version of their own deep-cut Night Boat.
It was very well received, and they've kept that theme going. In September 2024, they released New Moon Dark Phase, which is a reimagined version of their classic New Moon on Monday. And again, it features Andy Taylor on guitar. It shows they're constantly reevaluating their own catalog.
And looking at the events of just last year, 2025, and into this year, the band has remained very active.
Very. In 2025, they were special guests at the San Remo Music Festival in Italy, and they performed with Victoria DeAngelis, the bassist from Måneskin.
That was a great moment, a real cross-generational rock energy on stage.
And then just a few months ago, in October 2025, they released another re-recording, Shadows on Your Side. This was originally a deep cut from Seven and the Ragged Tiger.
And the new version features new guitar parts from Andy Taylor.
Yes. Nick Rose described it as being inspired by the madness and joy of Halloween. It really seems this Dance Macabre era has given them a whole new creative playground to explore.
So here we are in February 2026. Duran Duran is approaching their 50th anniversary as a band. They've survived lineup changes, changing musical trends, critical backlash, and profound personal tragedies.
They really have. They've evolved from the wild boys of the Rum Runner into true icons of the industry.
And their legacy is absolutely secure.
I think so. They bridged that gap between punk and disco, they revolutionized how music is visualized, and they proved that a band can age with dignity while still taking creative risks. They're not just an 80s band. They're, I think, a band for the ages.
A band that, even in 2026, still has plenty to say. It has been quite a journey from Birmingham to the Hall of Fame. Thanks for listening.